Hello, my name is Juan Echanove, and I am the Associate Vice President for Food and Water Systems at CARE. And this introduction is about CARE's main strategy for our work on food and water systems, or as we call it, the Right to Food, Water, and Nutrition Impact Area Strategy. And this strategy is something that we work together with teams from across the entire CARE Confederation. So it's really the result of the inputs from all parts of CARE. But maybe let's start by taking a step back, because this strategy, the Right to Food, Water, and Nutrition, is part of the wider multi-sector strategy of CARE called CARE 2030, our shared vision, which sets a number of priority areas of work, including the right to health, gender equality, women economic justice, climate justice, humanitarian action, and right to food, water, and nutrition, with a very ambitious target of improving the right to access food, water, and nutrition of 75 million people. This strategy is also aiming to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, impacting on poverty and equality, and it's built on the notion that we can only bring this transformation if we are driven by impact in terms of partnering, influencing with others to get this impact at a scale. So, why this strategy? Because we believe that the world produces enough food for everyone to eat, yet still many are hungry. And we know that gender-based discrimination is a main driver of food insecurity and limits access to safe water. So it's a major constraint for the right to food and the right to water by many people in the world. We also know that COVID-19 and further developments like the Ukraine war ongoing is pushing additional people into chronic hunger. And the demographic change currently going on means that urbanization is driving shifts in consumer choices. And also there is more people moving from rural areas to urban areas. Climate change disruptions and biodiversity loss are also profoundly impacting food and water systems. And we know also that there is at least 700 million people to be displaced to water scarcity by 2030. This is the projection. So the context is definitely not very positive. But our theory of change is that when women are actively engaged in food and water systems, and in many roles, but their contributions are not recognized. So they face these massive obstacles in engaging on equitable and fair terms. Transforming food systems for inclusion means not just ensuring the women's participation and accessing the benefits, but also empowering them to make strategic life choices. So women empowerment and gender transformative approaches is at the very core of our work in food and water systems. And our goal in our strategy is to ensure the fulfillment of the right to nutritious food and clean water for all by promoting sustainable, productive, equitable, and resilient food and water systems. Sustainable, productive, equitable, and resilient, or as we call these principles in CARE, the super principles. So sustainable, productive, equitable, and resilient food and water systems, livable incomes, and dignified livelihoods. And the model that is the basis of this theory of change is CARE Women Empowerment and Gender Transformative Theory of Change, which put forward this notion of three critical pillars in terms of transformed systems. One is agency, meaning strengthening the capacities, skills, confidence of the women and girls. Second is relations, so changing relations, meaning increasing women access to and control of the productive resources, the assets, the access to markets, access to services that they require, and also modifying the structures, so promoting inclusive policies, inclusive practices, strengthening local systems. So to sum up, food and water and nutrition justice is gender justice. The right to food, water, and nutrition articulates these messages around building agency, transforming relations, changing structures in a number of different areas of work, but we will look into them in the next slide in more detail. So basically, our strategy foresees 8 integrated priority areas of work. First is women access to and control of sustainable productive resources, all the resources that women, smaller scale producers require to produce, whether that is access to land, access to water for irrigation, access to credit, to funding, access to knowledge and expertise, etc. Number two is access to inclusive markets. What is the point in producing better yields that you can produce because you have better access to resources if that does not translate in better income because you are not tapping the market? Number three is nutrition. And this is phenomenally important because in care, all our work on food and water systems must be nutrition responsive, nutrition sensitive. Number four is social protection and local structures. Basically, this means that there are circumstances where even if we are trying to increase production and tapping the markets to increase income, because of shocks, because of different circumstances, we still need to undertake activities of a social protection network, whether that is a school feeding program or cash and vouchers, on linking communities to existing safety nets run by governments. Number five is food loss and waste. We know that at least 1/3 of all the food which is produced in the world is wasted or lost. So the idea here is to reduce that by a means of better post-harvest handling, things like better conservation, food processing to avoid food to be decayed, so food processing at farm level, etc. Number six is livelihood diversification and rural development. Why? Because not all farmers are only dependent on agricultural activities. Sometimes they have other sources of income, and also because many people in the rural areas are not only dependent on agriculture. So it's about diversifying alternatives of living, of farm activities, as we call them. Number seven is WASH. So it's basically hygiene, it's access to water at home for a human consumption. And number eight is water resource management and ecosystem protection. CARE has been working for many years in WASH, but before, historically, I worked in WASH, which is basically mainly focused on community-based WASH management or governance. It was kind of separate from our work on food. Right now, all our work in water and all our work on food are under this same umbrella of the right to food, water, and nutrition impact area strategy. Before the right to food, water, the right to food, water, and nutrition strategy was approved, already CARE had a strategy for working on food systems that we call She Feeds the World. And the She Feeds the World strategy, which is contained on a very detailed framework, the She Feeds the World framework, that puts together a menu of tools and approaches to tackle all these different interrelated areas, was already talking about productive resources, inclusive markets, nutrition, social protection, with women empowerment at the core of it as the main trigger or catalyzer for these changes. But there are these two areas of work that I mentioned before, food loss and waste, and livelihood diversification and rural development, which are new areas for CARE. So these are additions to our list of priorities working in food systems. And then the work in water systems, which is basically, as I mentioned, around WASH and around water resources management and ecosystem protection, including water for agriculture, has also been added now to the strategy. So this is a strategy that speaks both about food systems and water systems hand to hand. I'm not going to describe in detail each of these interrelated areas and the different types of activities that CARE promotes, because as part of this series of e-learning, videos accessible for everyone in terms of CARE working food and water systems, we have videos dedicated to each and every of them. So my only point here is that each of these interrelated areas of work opens a number of menus of specific types of activities that we promote. Like in the case of access to and control of productive resources, our activities on access and control of land, water, inputs, technologies, finance. And the same applies to all the other areas of work, like inclusive markets, where we work in inclusive value chains, food processing, collective marketing skills. And we can just move on. Our work on nutrition around promoting positive nutrition practices, promoting homestead food production, also improve sanitation, and strengthening coordination in nutrition, or as we call it, collective impact for nutrition. Social protection, and I already mentioned food aid, school feeding, cash vouchers, safety nets, are some of the activities that we do in that area of work. And finally, as I said, these are the new areas that we have added where we are now working in upfolding the different types of initiatives that we promote under those areas. But so far we have been describing these areas of work in a very linear manner, in a very linear fashion, but probably it's better if we see them as interrelated areas. They are like the bricks, like the mortar that, that together builds this house, and each piece it's part of the house. It's really important, right? Whether we talk about social protection, inclusive markets, etc. And the ground floor upon which we build this house is basically this theory of change for women empowerment and gender transformation that I keep referring to: building agency plus changing relations plus transforming structures. In terms of how we operationalize this strategy, we have a number of tools and approaches that I'm not going to describe here because, again, as I said, we have specific presentations on those. But one good example of that is our Farmer Field and Business School. And in other presentations, you will hear a lot about those. This strategy contains very concrete metrics, right? Speaking to each of these pillars of our work, agency relations structures. I'm not going to read all these metrics. Again, there is another presentation on that. But what is important to retain is that every time we are designing a new program for care, we have to be cognizant of these metrics, and we have to at least pick up 2 of these indicators and incorporate in our program. So when this information is incorporated to peers, our unified database that brings together all our programs, we can basically harmonize the information. The targeted population of care work in food and water systems, as I said, is mainly women, small-scale food producers. And our level of ambition, it's really very, very significant. We want to improve the life of 75 million people, at least 50% of them women. And this, as I said, include primarily women, small-scale food producers, but also women and girls living in water scarcity areas, as well as refugees, internally displaced populations, and affected populations in humanitarian and conflict contexts. Why? Because, as we see in this slide, our strategy applies not only to development context, but also to humanitarian and conflict contexts, even to nexus and fragile contexts. So this is our strategy for the working care in food and water systems, both in development context, in humanitarian context, and in the nexus, in between both. Of course, in different contexts, we apply differently. The bulk of our work in food and water systems happens in low developing countries, LDCs, but we also work sometimes in middle income countries, but our approaches are different. In those countries, we work more on advocacy and we work more through partners. The Vision 2030 sets a number of pathways in order to ensure that we will really reach a scale. So we want to transform food and water systems well beyond the communities we work via traditional programs. And this is why promoting alliances and partnerships is very important in our work, as well as promoting inclusive policies and advocacy so we can multiply the impact of what we do. And research and innovation, it's also critical, and we have a research agenda in our strategy. Indeed, multi-sectoral coordination as another mean to promote that multiplication of our impact and working with social movements. So it's not only about operating traditional programs, it's also about how we multiply the impact of what we do via these different pathways. I mentioned partnerships and I mentioned our learner agenda. And our learning agenda has one main question that we want to address, which is how does gender equality advance the realization of the right to food, water, and nutrition? So this important question basically goes across all our programs. Whenever we are implementing programs of any kind, whenever we have the possibility to do research, our learning agenda is guided by this overall question that can be broken down in more concrete aspects, such as scaling successes in food and water systems, how we address challenges in integrated humanitarian and development programming in food and water systems, or how we focus on food and water insecure women and girls. I mentioned system strengthening, I mentioned social accountability, supporting social movements, and inclusive market-based approaches is very important as part of our work. because of course there is a clear interface between working with market-based approaches and working in food systems. How we do that? Because we work very closely with VSLAs, Village Saving and Lending Associations, as one of the main platforms of our work, but also because we try to unlock small-scale farmers access to input and output markets. And we also promote, whenever possible, social businesses, engaging them, promoting them. We also work with cash and vouchers, which is a market-driven approach for our work in terms of safety nets and working in humanitarian contexts. Partnerships, as I mentioned, is something very important in our food and water systems work. And here you can see some of these main partners that we are promoting, and they are very diverse. They include specialized peer organizations like WWF, with whom we have a far-reach alliance, multi-country alliance. We also work in alliance with FAO and WFP, and with IFA, the international UN Rome-based organizations. We have very close relationships with them in terms of influencing, in terms of joint research, and in terms of advocacy. In terms of nutrition, we are part of the Scale-Up Nutrition movement, and we are very connected with them. And then, just to mention a couple of other examples, we are part of the Millennium Water Alliance, and we also work very closely with WaterAid. So we also have partnerships in that regard. We work with many global corporations in food systems. We have partnerships with international research organizations such as IDRC, or universities like Cornell or Wageningen, also with IFPRI, etc. So very diverse partnerships. And finally, as I mentioned, we are trying to promote much further our engagement with social movements in food systems and in water systems. So thank you so much for your attention to date.